Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey everybody, it is time for a Facebook Live. It's also time for me to record the 139th episode of Remarkable TV. No, it's not Remarkable TV. I do this all the time. Marissa, it's your fault. Of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Seriously, it's the 139 episodes of the podcast that I've done, that I've had conversations with folks. I should probably stop and say what I'm going to do today is I'm going to reflect on the last year's podcasts, all of the conversations that we did in 2018. Now, the main thing people probably think about in our podcast is the conversations that I have with folks. But in February of this past year, we started adding in the audios of our Remarkable TVs, which is probably why that was in my head. So that means that currently the way this works, if you're watching us maybe on Facebook Live here and wondering how this all goes, or if you're listening for the very first time to the podcast, that every Wednesday since June of 2016, we've released a conversation that I've had with an expert leader or leadership expert. But in February of this year, on Fridays, we added a short, the audio of videos that I do each week and have been doing for a very long time, 250 some episodes of those. So what we're going to talk about today, though, are the conversations. And this year, because in October we did extra conversations to celebrate our 25th anniversary, 56 conversations that I had with other smart people this year. So if I'm gonna do that every week, you would think that I might actually learn something. When you stop and think about, I was reflecting today on who I had on the show, who I had conversations with. Well, I had a conversation with a billionaire, a real live billionaire. I had a conversation with a person who wears a Super Bowl ring as a Super Bowl champion. I had a conversation with a former NFL cheerleader. I've had conversations with many, many best-selling authors, including 3 at least who would count the number of books they sold in the millions, and those being Seth Godin and Gittomer and Tom Peters. All 3 people that I look up to, and in fact, this was the first time I had a chance to talk with Tom Peters. So by my count, we've had at least in the last year, at least 8 leaders who founded or led for long periods of time companies other than training and development companies. So some of our guests who are authors, they're like me, they have a company that does the kind of work that I'm doing, or we're doing, but I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about folks like Cal Turner Jr., whose father started Dollar General and then he ran it for many years, and hint, he's the billionaire, and many, many others that we've had. So the point is, I had the chance to have, approximately 30-minute interviews with 56 of these folks. If I didn't learn something, then there's probably something wrong with Kevin. And so the good news for you is that you can go back and listen to those, and in some cases watch those now. But what I'm going to do today is take just a few minutes to talk about what I learned. And now, if you've watched or listened before, you know that near the end of every episode, after I'm sort of finished asking questions of my guest, I ask my listeners a 2-word question. And the question is, now what? Now what are you going to do with what you got? And so I decided, or actually Lisa, our producer, and I decided that it would be good for me to answer that question today. Now what? What has Kevin gotten? What has Kevin done with what he's gotten from these conversations? Well, as I said, there are 56 of these conversations, and some of them, because we record ahead, some of them took place well over a year ago. So I know there are many things that I've implemented or many things that I learned that I haven't included here. And so I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to make some general observations about things that don't just come from one episode. And then I'm going to certainly talk about some very specific things that I got from specific episodes as well. And along the way, maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about how this podcast works. But I want to say that as I'm doing these, before I hit record with my guest, I always ask them what they want to get from the episode and what I can do to best serve them and their needs. And then then they typically ask that question in response, and I say, well, a perfect conversation for me is one that feels like a true conversation. So while I always have questions, what I'm really hoping for and planning for is to create a real conversation with these really, really smart folks, many of whom have very different kinds of experiences and backgrounds than I do, or most of those people who are listening. So I will tell you this, that as I am doing the episodes, when I'm having these conversations, that I'm listening for three reasons. And hopefully that shows through in this conversation today. I listen for the guest because I want to make it great for them. I want to create a great conversation, and I want to make a great connection with them. So I'm listening for that. I'm listening for my listener, for my audience, because I want to make it a great show. And I'm listening to every episode for myself because I'm a leader. Like I'm in the perfect target audience for the show. And so if you've ever watched any of the episodes, you'll see me taking notes. Sometimes those notes are about things that they've said that I want to follow up on. And sometimes those notes are the things that I want to do something with. So I'm going to share some of those with you. One more thing sort of behind the curtain though before we go in. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how we find or how we get our guests. And 2.5 years ago when we started, 139 episodes ago, we were reaching out to folks, asking them to be guests, and we reached out very early to people that I knew in the industry, really, really smart folks who maybe had new books, and we reached out to them. But as time has gone on, and as the podcast has built a bit of a reputation and some longevity, we get all sorts of requests to have people on the show. Like we have PR agencies calling us, sending us books, and what's the word, Marissa? Unrequested, unsolicited books. We get them all the time. She's nodding. She goes, yep, they show up pretty much every day. And some of them we request. Some of people will say, we'd like to have this person on, or I'd like to be on. I say, send us a book, let's take a look, and then we make a decision. But we work really hard to find really, really great guests, and I'm sure there are many that we could have that we don't. But we work really hard to find great guests, and so I guess the reason for sharing that is that there's not really any thematic things up front about who we pick. Although there's certainly certain kinds of shows that we like and things that we think are related to our brand and what we're trying to accomplish and what we think our listeners and viewers want. And so what I would say this is that of the 56, about 20 of them I would say were episodes that were specifically around leadership development topics. Some of them about specific areas like resilience or flexibility or those sorts of things, but in what I would call general leadership development areas. And then there were about 14 more that I would say are about learning or personal development, or the blur between personal and professional development, and maybe some of them kind of in the career-y area, although we're not really doing a podcast about careers. We are doing a podcast for leaders, and leaders are learners. So I've double counted some of those, but so there's 34 of the 56 that are in those two broad areas. We had a lot of other areas. We had some with some folks who I didn't really say there was a specific message going in, like Cal Turner Jr., our billionaire, and like Gary Brackett, our entrepreneur and Super Bowl champion. I didn't really have a specific thing, but I wanted to have them on. We've had a number of episodes that were specifically around culture issues this year, around innovation and change issues, lots more, of course. But just again, if you're new or you're just sort of getting a sense, there's the background of how we go about it. People are reaching out to us, and we're making selections. And as I often say, we're trying to find leadership experts and expert leaders. And sometimes we find people who are both, which is really, really excellent. And I'll probably mention a couple of those names as we go. There are some general things that I would take from the year that if you were to say, so Kevin, what did you get in general from the year? Here are some of the things. There were an awful lot of things where our guests were very much in alignment with the way that we believe and the things that we teach to our clients and the ways that we coach and that sort of thing. So that's sort of nice to know that others sort of have similar sorts of approaches. Of course, they come at it slightly differently, say it a different way, provide a nuance that's really, really exceptional. And then, of course, there were many other guests where their area of focus wasn't necessarily something that we focus on. And so it was great from that perspective, right? But one of the big learnings for me this year was how many of our guests talk about principles. One of our guests, and I don't have it written down here, I don't remember who it was, says we're going to talk about principles and not a playbook. In other words, we're not talking about tactics, but we're talking about foundational principles that last forever. That's a big part of what we're about, so it's great to know that we're not the only people in the world that think that way, I suppose. There were many, many guests, regardless of what the stated topic was or what the title of the podcast was about, where the topic of listening showed up. It showed up, I don't know, half of the episodes where it came up. And it wasn't because of a question I asked, but it was because of something that came out of the conversation. There was a lot of conversation about the leaders' need to be decisive and our needing to have the willingness to be decisive and to make decisions. And that came up, again, not on purpose. It just seemed to show up in many, many of the conversations. And then, as I mentioned, there were several episodes specifically about culture. But culture, organizational culture, came up a lot during our conversations. And in fact, in one of those specifically, Jeff Manchester, and it was in episode number 92, if you're following your program, he made the statement, and I thought about it a lot this year. He made the statement that we should think of our culture, our organizational culture, we should think of our organizational culture as an asset. And if you think about assets, they are valuable, number one, and they're also things that we try to grow, like we try to get a return on our assets. And I believe that Jeff's right, that if we were to think about culture like an asset, we would work to grow it, we would work to enhance it, we would work to create it to be what we want it to be, because we all have one. And the other thing I would say is if we think of it as an asset, we might say, well, it's not a very valuable one, perhaps, if our culture isn't what we want it to be. So to me, that was an idea that sort of had an asterisk for me all year. It's something that I've thought a lot about for with our clients as we work with clients about culture, and it's certainly something I've thought about our company culture here with 14 or 15 of us hanging around the remarkable universe. It's now a universe, Marissa. I can't just say remarkable house, everybody, because there's only a couple people that work here. Everyone else is spread out across the country. Another theme that came out a lot, and this is something that maybe I noticed it because it's important to me, but it was reinforced for me a lot during the course of the year, was the idea and the importance of being more intentional. And I suppose that shouldn't surprise anyone, because if you think about having conversations with really, really smart people, with high achievers, there's a strong connection between people being having high achievement and being intentional, that making conscious decisions for more of their life than those who don't have that much achievement. And so I think that probably makes sense. But maybe the single conversation that I had about intention that stopped me in my tracks, and I've repeated it to a bunch of people since it happened, is when I interviewed Seth Godin. When I interviewed Seth, it was about his brand new book, This Is Marketing, I believe it's called. And one of the things that, if you know anything about Seth Godin, you know that he he writes a blog, and he writes it every day. It's not very long. It's probably less than 300 words most every day, but it's every day, and it has been that way for many years. And so I wanted to ask him the question for myself, as well as for the listeners. It said, so where does the discipline come from? Talk to me about the discipline that it takes to do it every single day, to not miss a birthday, an anniversary, a Christmas, or whatever. And he said, Kevin, I don't like to think about discipline. I like to think about the fact that I'm doing it intentionally. It's not that I have to do it. It's that I get to do it. And that was such a powerful idea for me. And I suppose in some ways I've talked about those things and thought about that before. But to hear it from someone else, I think that's one of the great things about an interview style or a conversation style podcast, is that you just get to hear things perhaps that you already knew, but you hear them in a new way. To hear Seth say, it's not something I have to do, it's something that I get to do. It's something that I choose to do, that I'm doing it from a place of intention. And I have had people that know me professionally especially, say, Kevin, you're one of the most intentional people that I know. I take that as a compliment, but I think I'm far, far, far from that standard that Seth set for me in that conversation. So we heard a lot this year about intention, and so I thought I'd share that with you. Chris McGough in episode 110, and he was one of the top 10 most downloaded episodes of the year. If you go back and listen to last week's episode, he made a statement. He said, there's a difference, Kevin, between a statement and a request and a command. And here's the example that he used in our conversation. He said, there's a statement, and that is, the garbage is full. There's a request, Marissa, would you please take out the garbage? I think he used Marissa. But for those of you that don't know, Marissa's on the other side of the camera right now. And part of my goal in life is to make her laugh. And so I just did it again. And then Chris said that a command is take out the garbage. So it's, the garbage is full. Marissa, would you please take out the garbage? And take out the garbage. And I don't even really remember the full context of our conversation about those three things, but I remember that I wrote them down. And here's what I have thought about a lot since he and I had that conversation. And that is that I think that many times people, and many times leaders, make statements assuming that people see them as requests. Right? We make the statement or the observation that the garbage is full, and since he used the example of garbage, I'll stay with that example, and I'll say, you might as a parent say to your kids, the garbage is full, and you're thinking that's a request. And you're wondering why they don't take out the garbage. Well, maybe we could hope that they would. Maybe we could hope that they would read our mind. And if we're leading folks, I often say it's not part of their job description to read our mind. And so I think that we would serve ourselves well to be better communicators and to be less frustrated, perhaps, and to certainly be more clear, is to make the request and not just make the statement and make an assumption that people will understand it to be a request. I think that's a gap that people have often, and again, I don't even really remember the context of Chris and I's conversation. You can go back and listen to it on episode 110, but that's one of the things that I got from he and I's time. In my podcast with my conversation with Paul Cummings, the book is titled 120, It All Matters, I think is the title, 125 somethings. And I didn't write down the episode number for Paul, but it's in the 90s. Paul and I had a really great conversation, and he and I talked about the power of finishing. And lots of people will talk about, well, we need to get closure. I think pretty much everyone would agree with that. And yet, the way he and I talked about it, in that phrase, the power of finishing, has been something that stuck with me a lot. I don't always close things out well or as successfully as I could. And I know that my team, as a team, probably a reflection of me, we don't always close as strongly as we could. We don't always run through the finish line as strongly or as fast as we could. And I see it with organizations all the time. On a project, you get to the 95%, and then people start fading away, and then someone's supposed to carry the ball the last little bit. And I think the power of finishing is a powerful thought, something I've thought a lot about this year and have tried to get better at it for myself. And I think our team, as we're working hard at sort of project management principles, we're doing a better job of that, in part because I'm focusing on it a little bit more, even if maybe I haven't really talked about it with the team a whole lot. There was another episode, two people actually, this idea that I'm going to talk about next came from. One of them was from my conversation with Morton Hansen, and his episode was like the 11th or 12th most downloaded episode of the year. And we had a really great conversation. And one of the things that he talked about, the phrase that he used, was the idea of fight and unite. In other words, a team must be willing to have conflict and to really work through ideas and polish ideas by sharing them with each other and challenging each other, fight and then unite. And I love that phrase. Of course, I love the way it rhymes and all that stuff, but it reminded me when I was preparing for last week's podcast, and I talked about Andy Cunningham in my conversation with her about her book, Getting to Aha. Like I said, I'm going to hope that that's the right book title. But she and I talked about the fact that she was on the launch team for the Mac, for the original Mac. And she made a comment that said that when that team was working on something, they would leave with 60% agreement, but 100% buy-in. And I think if you take that idea, which I think is super interesting, a great way to think about a strong team, that we don't all have to agree, but when we leave, we're in, and we're not picking on the ideas. We're bought in and we're moving forward. I think if you take that idea of 60% agreement but 100% buy-in when we walk out, and hook it together with this idea of fight and unite, I think it's the same idea, come at from two different places. One as a phrase and one as a story, but I think they get us to the same place, and I think it's worth us thinking about. Sometimes as leaders, we want to avoid the conflict or minimize the conflict, and so we may lose the richness of conversation. Now, we want conflict that doesn't become nasty or other things, right? But the conflict that's healthy, that allows for us to really build something and grow something and hone ideas. Sometimes leaders are afraid of that. And sometimes leaders aren't afraid of that, but they're afraid of, they don't know how to close the conflict down. They don't know how to get to the unite. Some people are afraid of the fight, and some people are afraid of the unite or don't get to the unite. And so I think that idea of hooking those together is really, really smart. And so there's that. In episode number 97, and I know these are kind of random, but hopefully one or two or three of these things will really connect with you. Honestly, I hope that you'll go back and choose to listen to some of these episodes. But really, again, my goal here was simply to say, what were some of my now what's from the various episodes? And again, only a smattering. I've got a few more to share with you. In episode number 97, we had Gary Brackett on. And Gary is a Super Bowl winning linebacker from the Indianapolis Colts, and now for the last number of years he's an entrepreneur. He's got an MBA from Rutgers. He's an entrepreneur, runs a bunch of restaurants in Indianapolis and spread around the Midwest mostly. And he made this statement, and he said that leaders are as good as their last meeting. Now, as I thought about it later, I thought, I'm sure that relates to a football experience if we're only as good as our last game. But his point was very straightforward. Leaders are only as good as their last meeting. And I think that's true. And I also think that that's especially powerful for those of us who lead a remote team, with whom the people we don't see every day. So our last interaction with them plays a huge role. And we have fewer interactions with our remote team members, so everyone carries greater weight. And so this idea that leaders are only as good as their last meeting, that you are only as good as your last meeting, is a challenge I think worth considering. In episode 107, with Cash Cahey, we talked about learning from U.S. presidents, and he is an expert around Myers-Briggs and typology, and he talks about 8 leader types, and he talks about all the U.S. presidents and hooks them in to these leader types. And so what I loved about that episode was the fact that we can learn about leading by observing others, and I've long been a fan of that, and from any number of folks, but certainly U.S. presidents are a place to learn from. And he and I's conversation was not political, and my comments now are not political, but rather these are folks who lots have been written about, or certainly now as you're living, some are around. You have the chance to observe them in real time, and so you have opportunities to say what's working, what's not. Is that what I would do? And maybe what does their style say, and what does that style do in terms of what leads to in terms of their strengths and their work? And I think that's worth thinking about. In episode number 99, I had on Mark Miller, who's an executive at Chick-fil-A, and he's written a number of great books. And we talked about his book, Talent Magnet. And I've thought about one set of statements that he made in that podcast a lot. And I think any of my team who's listening or watching will recognize this lesson, although I never said it to them quite this way. Mark, we were talking about how can an organization be a talent magnet, and in a time of full employment, like now, when there are way more job opportunities than there are folks going after them, being a talent magnet is more important than ever to get the right talent, to get the talent that we really want and we need. And Mark said there are 3 things that people want. They want a better boss, a brighter future, and a bigger vision. So think about that. They want a great boss to work for. They want a picture of their future that looks really good and it looks brighter for them. And they want a vision of a place to work where there's meaning, where it can make a difference for them. And to me, that 3-point thing was a great lesson for me. It's been a mantra that I've had in my mind now for several months. People want a better boss, a brighter future, and a bigger vision. And it's said extremely well, and I think is profoundly true. Speaking of things being said well, I was challenged by Mary Abijay, and I don't have the episode number. Her book is titled Managing Up, and our podcast conversation was titled Managing Up with Mary Abijay. She said something that made me stop, and has had me thinking about it many times. It challenged me a lot. And she said that, I believe, this is the way I remember it anyway, that she has a Post-it note or something on her computer monitor that has the word wait on it, W-A-I-T. And she says that reminds her to ask this question: why am I talking? And I think that question is so powerful, because especially, I think for leaders in general, I think especially when you are a more extroverted leader and you think out loud to start with, and so you are more prone to talk, that oftentimes we're talking when we should be asking, and we're talking when we should be listening, and we're just talking when we should just shut up. So being reminded often over the last several months of the brilliant thought from Mary. I don't know if it's her original thought or where she got it. Doesn't matter. Wait. Why am I talking? And maybe that resonates with you. Marissa might say, I haven't followed that very well. I don't know. And the last one I want to mention is from a gentleman named Cameron Mitchell. And I had a conversation with him. He is a restaurateur, has started many restaurant brands and many restaurants, and done it very successfully. His book is sort of about hospitality and customer service, and a little bit of his autobiography sprinkled in. And he made a statement that I think is super powerful. It's, again, another one that stuck with me. He made the statement that yes requires action. And so his comment was, from a customer service perspective, that if we say yes, then we must act to take care of the situation or do whatever. But I think he and I's conversation, we talked about it more broadly than that the idea of saying yes to things requires us to take action. And many of us say yes a lot, and sometimes then don't follow through. And so I think reminding ourselves that yes requires action, whether we say yes to ourselves, say yes to an opportunity, say yes to a team member, that requires us then that we are duty bound to take action on it. And if we don't, we will hurt trust, and we will get poor results and a whole bunch of other things. But so I leave you with that thought: yes requires action. Now maybe it makes sense that I'm closing there, or almost closing there, because I'm hoping that you take some action, that there's something from this episode, like all of the conversation episodes, when I say, now what are you going to do? I would challenge you with that here as well. Now what? What are you going to do? But here's a couple of now what's for you beyond your own reflections on what I've shared. One is you can go to remarkablepodcast.com. In fact, I'd love for you to go to remarkablepodcast.com. If you're listening to this after the podcast has come out, go to remarkablepodcast.com, see what else is there, find some of the other episodes to watch or listen to. And also, if you would comment on this episode's page as to what you learned, either what you've learned from one of the podcasts this year or what you learned from this episode, just comment for us there. And if you've been watching us on Facebook Live, or the replay on the Facebook Live, you can comment right here on Facebook and tell us what you got from this. I would love that. And I know that others who see those comments would love it as well. Like, what did you get from this episode? Now what? What are you going to do? What action are you going to take? What did you learn from this episode? That would be really great. And the last thing I want to ask you in this episode is that if there's someone, if you've been watching or listening, and there's someone that, man, I really would love to hear Kevin have a conversation with this person. We'd love to know who you'd like to have me talk to. And if it's someone that you know and then can get us a connection to them, all the better. But we'd just love to know who you'd like to hear. And then we will do our best to see if that's a good fit and see if we can make that happen. But I'll just leave you with that. So you can let us know. You can just send an email to Lisa at kevineikenberry.com, or put that in the comments as well. Hey, I'd like to hear you have a conversation with this person, and we'd love to do what we can to make those happen. I want to close this episode, the first episode of 2019, as we reflect back on 2018, by thanking you. Whether this is the first one you listened to as a part of a New Year's resolution, or whether you've been listening for a long time. I want to thank you for spending some of your time, for investing some of your time with us. I hope that it's been entertaining, but more importantly, I hope it's been educational and prompts you to say yes, prompts you to take action. It's been a pleasure to spend a few minutes with you here, and I hope to see you again on another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.